Hello everyone, my name is Jonn Elledge. I'm a journalist for the new Statesman. I edit our sister site Citymetric, where I think a lot about urban government and urban attitudes. I also have a sideline in ranting about Brexit. So obviously I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm even more excited to see how many of you are here today, because these are very important issues that everyone should be excited about, if you ask me. So yes, on this panel we are going to talk about cities versus the rest. Is this the new divide? I have sort of spotted, I think I've spotted a pattern. Maybe I'm primed to spot this pattern, but it felt to me like the kind of places that swung for leave in the 2016 referendum and the kind of places that had historically gone for the Democrats but went for Donald Trump later in 2016 look kind of similar. It's those kind of smaller cities that kind of feel a long way from the sort of booming metropolitan centres. I think you can see a different version of that pattern in the 2017 election, where sort of cities tended to sort of move towards Labour. But, you know, we will hear more about whether or not I'm talking rubbish here as the panel goes on. I shall stop talking and introduce them. To my left, we have Lisa Nandy, who's been the Labour Member of Parliament for Wigan since 2010. She has, among other roles, been Shadow Children's Minister, Shadow Energy Secretary, and Shadow Minister for Civil Society, and one of her campaigning interests is a higher profile for Britain's towns. Sir John Curtice, of course, is a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He's a political scientist at the University of Strathclyde, president of the British Polling Council, is often to be found on television talking about psephology, and he's also a senior fellow of the UK in a Changing Europe. Last but not least, we have Will Jennings, Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Southampton, whose research explores questions relating to public policy and public opinion, as well as geographical divides of the sort we're going to talk about now. I will ask Will to kick off, please.
Okay. Thanks, John. And that's set it up very nicely, actually. I think the last panel set up a lot of the conversations we're going to have. I think nobody could have lived through the last 18 months, 2 years of British politics and not had a sense of a divided nation. I know a kind of a divided politics that's divided by people, but also place. And one of my research interests in work I've been doing with the Centre for Towns, colleagues Centre for Towns, also with Gerry Stoker, is in the divide of electoral geography and also being structured by demographics. And I think while we've talked a lot over the last few years about issues around immigration and so forth, I think place really matters, and so it's really nice to hear a conversation about place-based policy making. So, as a typical academic, I'm going to show you a few graphs, right, to kind of to make my point about what I think is going on. This analysis we've done for the Centre of Towns, just to give you a sense of the real change that's happening in different places across the country. Because I think once we start to understand these processes, we get a sense of how our politics is changing, but also how the policy challenges facing government at local and national levels is changing. Oh, sorry, this has gone slide through. Whoa, what's going on? Hello. I don't know, this is some... who? I've got some errant... Are we okay? I don't know what I'm doing. This is the difference in the old age dependency ratio over the period between 1981 to 2011. The old age dependency ratio is the proportion of working age people, of people over 65 to working age people. And so what you see here, just very simply in this graph, is a trend in which cities and large towns are getting younger and towns and villages are getting older. And small towns are getting older. So we see this real growing divide, and that growing demographic divide has consequences for our politics, because we know that these cities are getting young, they're younger and they're getting younger, they're more diverse and they're getting more diverse, and they're becoming more socially liberal. And so that's the sort of forces that are underpinning the patterns we saw of voting in Brexit in terms of cities. Actually, putting together these graphs, then you start thinking about, oh, well, what about the outliers? I actually recently did some analysis looking just specifically at Cambridge. I think in our Centre for Towns analysis, we're going to need to start looking at university towns, because they have, so, you know, there can be smaller towns that have some of these similar underlying dynamics. Whereas in towns and villages, we see ageing populations that haven't seen the same changes in ethnic diversity, are more socially conservative. Those political divides really matter, and they also matter, of course, for public services. If you think about kind of major challenges in terms of NHS social care, rural areas, smaller towns are at the real front line of the kind of pressures on public services, and voted for Brexit. And I think in the report that was produced for this event, there's some interesting actually divergence in the economic analysis that has been put forward. And so this uncertainty was talked about earlier is about actually where are the consequences going to be focused. So this is the sort of concern we've got at the centre of towns, actually, what is going to happen to these towns and villages, smaller towns that are seeing demographic change? It matters for our national politics, because if you look at the Conservative to Labour swing, oh, God, I don't know what's going here. I think some sort of, if I put my hand too close. Okay, Conservative to Labour swing between 2005 and 2017, we see Labour, the vote, despite in a period actually where Labour's vote has kind of risen and fallen, has swung towards, the votes swung towards Labour in large core cities, places over 500, that population of over 500,000. But in large towns, and especially in small towns, places either between 100,000 to 500,000 or places under 100,000 to 75,000 people, have swung against Labour. So actually what we see in our politics, alongside these demographic shifts, is a divergence, okay? And that's actually one of the trends we saw in the 2017 election, actually, these variable patterns, these surprise patterns where Labour doing well in certain areas but losing seats like Mansfield or so forth. So these demographic changes, divergence between cities and towns, is really mattering for our politics. What I just want to close up with in terms of the analysis we've been doing is actually looking at the importance of decline. Oh, gosh, sorry. I promise I'm not touching anything. We're interested in the impact of decline. I mean, I think it's well established the importance of immigration to the Brexit vote. But it's very clear that the places that people live, the economic context in which they're operating, long-term decline of places is impacting on the way that people perceive their area and what's going on around them. And so some of the analysis we've been doing is drawing on work that was done by Andy Pike and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, develop a measure of demographic economic decline, which captures both demographic aging, outflows and inflows of young populations and economic activity, to get a sense of how places have changed, whether places are areas of high growth that are concentrated in areas that have been favoured by the modern agglomeration knowledge economy that we live in today, or places that have seen outflows of young people. Some of the analysis we're interested in actually in the centre of towns is ideas that have been around actually in economic geography for a while about the escalator, the idea that cities, and actually university towns as well, suck in young people into kind of education and employment and then deposit their remains in the suburbs and beyond. I think actually this is, these are underpinning the dynamics we're seeing. So what we do very, very briefly is we construct this measure of decline between 1981 and 2011 based on census data, looking at change in economic activity, the size of the population, the percentage of young people, 15 to 19, the employment rate, and the percentage of working age population employed in manufacturing. And I'll show you a graph. I've learned recently to draw maps. I'm very pleased I draw a map. And so in some senses, all you need to take from this graph is on what... Oh, I think it's whenever I put my hand, I've got some magical power that... hang on. I'm not going to put my hands anywhere near the board. A Londonification of British politics, right? So these are the counting areas from the referendum, and you see the areas of high growth that have experienced least decline are areas around London, actually some cities in the north. I've been pondering about this a little bit, actually, why this might be the case. I wonder whether the timing of the 1981 census around a kind of recession maybe has amplified some of the growth seen actually in kind of places in the northwest and so forth. And we need to investigate that earlier. But you can see very clear patterns, and if you overlaid this map on a map of the Brexit vote, you would see very strong correspondence. And so I will do that here, if this will respond to me. This is the correspondence between the pattern of relative decline and Brexit. So areas that have experienced most decline in terms of outflows of young people, aging populations, less growth of economic activity, tended to be the areas that voted for Brexit, and areas of high growth have tended to vote for Remain in the strongest amount. So sum up, I think, understand, it's very clear that the importance of issues around identity, cultural backlash, and so forth. But there's a real important sense in which we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of place and geography to current British politics, because it's structuring both electoral politics, but it's also going to structure the major policy challenges we face and the sorts of responses that are needed in terms of devolution, decentralisation, and so forth. Thank you. I worried you, John. If John goes through smoothly, then we'll know it's entirely my fault.
We shall see. Let's see if we can get anywhere so far. Yes, right, okay. I need to fess up straight away. I'm going to nitpick for the next 5 minutes. Will's given you some idea of some of the work that he's been doing with Gerry Stoker, looking at long-term changes in the psephology of England. And I would recommend anybody to read their two articles in Political Quarterly. They're so good, they're worth nitpicking, okay? I'm not entirely sure, as you will discover, that I agree with all of it, but I think certainly that should not take away from the central message that they have pointed out a fascinating development. Now, here's my understanding of what they're saying, which Will's already outlined to some degree, is that, first of all, city/university England has swung towards Labour, while peripheral coastal England has moved towards the Conservatives. And that the reason they argue this is the case, as already Will's implied, is that essentially these are more cosmopolitan, socially liberal parts of the UK. And this is part of England, and this is part of the manifestation of how the difference between social liberals and social conservatives, rather than difference between those on the left and on the right, have become much more important for our politics. But then crucially, they argue, look, hang on, don't think that this is something that just starts with Brexit. It's something that's evident in the pattern of movement between 2005 and 2015. And indeed, they go on to argue that actually they don't think that Brexit did make much difference in itself to the bifurcation of England, that it's something that was already in evidence in advance. Now, looks like I have to kind of press a few times and then I get there. No. Is somebody able to move it on to the next slide? Ah, brilliant. Oh, I point to the screen. Oh, I see. Right, okay. I'm used to having computers. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why I find their thesis so fascinating is that when I started working in electoral psephology kind of about 35 years ago, it was also still the case, and had been the case, for around the previous 35 years or so before that, that urban England had been moving towards the Labour Party. This is not new, and indeed I've given you a simple calculation there, that between 1955 and 1983, looking at the balance of support for Conservative and Labour, urban constituencies, city constituencies, have moved by about 11% more to Labour and away from the Conservatives as compared with the country as a whole. So in effect, I mean, Will in his article started with 2005. There's nothing, really isn't anything new about this. The process of urban England moving towards the Labour Party is a very, very long process. But of course, the fascinating thing is that apparently we're still finding the Labour Party gaining ground relatively in urban England, even though the underlying social and economic dynamics of cities is thought to have changed, because you're now arguing that the Labour Party is doing well in urban England, not because it's an area of relative decline, which was the argument that we had in the 1980s. The argument in the 1980s was urban England, together with the north of England and the Midlands, were moving towards the Labour Party because these are places that were not doing so well out of capitalism. They therefore need more in the way of regional aid, state aid, etc., etc. Therefore, they were more likely to vote for a party that was in favour of those propositions. So the interesting thing, however, is that we're now apparently still, according to this thesis, seeing Labour gaining ground in the cities now, not because they're places of decline, but because they're places of relative prosperity. But that therefore, the driver now, however, is not because of arguments about the role of the state in the economy, it's about social liberalism. So whatever else we said, I hope I demonstrate to you that what they're arguing is absolutely fascinating, because it helps to explain perhaps why we've got similarity of patterns, even though the sociology and the economics of cities has fundamentally changed. Remember, I mean, again, I'm old enough to remember we didn't talk about this as being a dynamic city. We talked about this as a place that was losing people hand over foot. And this is a phenomenon of around since around the mid-1990s or so. Okay, right, now if I point to the screen. Yes, wonderful. So point one, just to confirm what Will and Gerry are arguing, I'm now defining constituencies and I'm defining cities with respect to population density. Okay, right, you defined it as conglomerations. I'm defining constituencies with population density. So these are constituencies that are cities. These are defined as urban. The remainder is just because there isn't much difference amongst these. And basically, the blue lines, as you can see, the Conservatives were which way round is this? Anyway, yes, right. So the Conservatives, I think these are the wrong way around, by the way, anyway, so I'm always doing this. So anyway, basically the Conservatives are doing, Labour Party is gaining ground more in cities. I think this is what you should think of this as being cities and this being remainder, right? They're the wrong way around. So the Labour Party is both in the 2005 to 2015 period, the Conservatives are making virtually no advance in cities, and in the 2015 to 17, the cities are swinging much more. So just think of it the opposite way around. So your basic point is right. To that extent, at least, the psephology of 2005 to 17 looks very similar to 2005 to 15. Let's hope I've got the rest of these right. Yeah, that's for the better. Now, and certainly there is plenty of evidence to suggest that indeed our cities and our city constituencies, as I've defined them, are more socially liberal. As you can see, for example, they were less likely to vote for UKIP in 2015. They were less likely to vote for Leave in 2016, though note about half of that difference, is something I'll come back to, is accounted for by London. I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves is to what extent is the story that Will and Gerry are telling us a story about London as opposed to a story about urban city England in general. It's also certainly true, this is using data from Chris Hanratty at Royal Holloway, city constituencies are much more liberal on the issue of immigration than are those in provincial England. But note, they are also more left-wing when you ask them about the redistribution of income. So that kind of is a question mark in my mind about, well, is this simply necessarily just being driven by social liberalism? Cities do also actually end up being relatively left-wing, using redistribution as a measure. Although, you know, in fairness to Will and Gerry, the difference on this measure, attitudes towards immigration, is bigger than the difference on this measure. Certainly what we know is true is that, again, as Will and Gerry have pointed out, cities distinguish very much from the rest of the country when it comes to their demography, and they do so in ways that we know are related to how people voted in the referendum. So they have a younger population, they have fewer older people in my graph here. They tend to have fewer people with educational qualifications, but the division's not that dramatic. But note that the thing that above all that distinguishes our cities, and this is true outside of London as well, is that they contain far more people from an ethnic minority background. And we should bear in mind that another long-term truth about voting behaviour in the UK is that people from an ethnic minority background are much more likely to vote for the Labour Party, and that has long been true. There's then, I think, also a need to think about what are the processes here. There are really two reasons as to why cities could be moving towards the Labour Party as a result of their social liberalism. One is that social liberalism has come to matter more. The other is that the demography of our cities is changing, and these are not necessarily the same processes. And if indeed it's the latter, then we can't use the relationship between city supporting and voting Labour as necessary evidence that social liberalism is becoming more or less important for individual voters. And certainly, again, Will showed you this story already, but that basically, for example, the cities have become less likely to have, again, I think I've got these the wrong way around, but basically the cities have become younger. But also, crucially, the thing that above all that distinguishes cities is that they've become much more ethnically diverse. This is the demography that above all that they have changed. And there is certainly every good reason to anticipate that that demographic change, as opposed to the increased importance of social liberalism, is at least part of the story. Again, one other point coming back to the question about how far is this a citywide phenomenon. One of the things that Will and Gerry argue is that the reason why cities are more social liberal is because they're more effectively connected to the global cosmopolitan economy, that these are places of dynamic growth. Well, London, yes, as you can see, I'm now just taking the number of people on the electoral register. London has indeed reversed its decline quite sharply, and it now has the fastest growing electorate in the UK. Conservative Party note when it comes to the question of boundary redistribution. But when we look at our city constituencies in the provinces, population growth here, at least as measured by the electoral register, is still much weaker. So I'm not quite sure how far we can argue that we are simply looking at an urban phenomenon that's driven by connectedness to economic growth, because insofar as population is an indicator of what you're talking about, I'm not sure that it works. But then finally, two other points. This is really to come up to the point, because in a sense, the interesting challenge about putting Will on this stage is, here is somebody who says, look, Brexit didn't really matter, and he's speaking at a Brexit conference. Right? This is a brave thing to do, so all power to Robo. But two things that make me go, well, hang on, I'm not convinced. Although, as I've shown, there is clearly a link between 2015 and 17 in terms of cities moving towards Labour, and that pattern is very, very similar to what happened in 2005 to 2015. There are other ways in which the geography is different. Here's one example. Here, for example, is just looking at the relationship between the proportion of people without qualifications in a constituency and the movement in, again, 2005 to 15 and 15 to 17. Now, in 2015 to 17, Labour definitely are doing much better. The minus means good news for Labour. Labour Party are definitely doing, and again, I'm not sure these are the right. Yes, Labour Party are doing better here. Labour Party are definitely doing better in places with high qualifications, all right? Labour Party are doing well in places where there aren't many people with low qualifications. And you can see a clear gradient here. Whereas, in contrast, look at the period between 2005 to 2015. There isn't any obvious link between the educational background of a constituency and the movement. And so, again, that suggests that, given we know that education is very strongly related to Brexit vote, that there is something to 2015 to 17 that isn't just the same as 2005 to 15. But, of course, also the other thing we have to do at the end of the day to really get at this issue is to look at the individual level data. What I'm doing here is using a measure from British social attitudes that divides people according to whether they're essentially social liberals or social conservatives. And I'm showing you the movement amongst these groups, first of all, again, between 2005 and 2015, and then between 2015 and 2017. Notice that basically the movement to the Conservatives between 2005 and 2015 does not bear any relationship to whether or not we're looking at the social liberal or the socially conservative section of the electorate. In contrast, between 2015 and 2017, there is a clear swing to Labour amongst the socially liberal, whereas the Conservatives do relatively well amongst socially conservative. So that's my other reason for arguing that this is nothing to deny that Will and Gerry have found a very important pattern, and that indeed the social liberalism of the cities is undoubtedly probably part of the story. But I think, there is certainly a risk in going on to argue from that therefore Brexit hasn't added anything to the pot. I would argue that it has, and that therefore, as I've been arguing elsewhere, that Brexit is actually being disruptive of the normal patterns of politics. And on that point, at least, you've still not yet persuaded me.
Right, well, you'll be relieved to learn, first of all, that I don't have any slides.
Let alone ones that go wrong.
And actually, that I think, to be honest, there isn't much of a difference between both of the things that I've just heard, because a town like mine in Wigan has long been socially conservative, but consistently voted Labour for nearly 100 years. And actually, I think that the trends that we're seeing are a lot to do with how politics has shifted rather than how people have shifted over that time. When you come to Wigan, one of the first things that you'll feel is a real sense of frustration. Frustration about the lack of progress that we've made over the last few years, particularly since the Brexit vote. But it's a very different sort of frustration than the frustration that I feel in Whitehall and Westminster every day about the lack of progress on those crucial details, technical, legal details about the shape of the deal and the future relationship with the EU. The frustration in towns like mine stems much more from a sense that politicians collectively, from UKIP and the Tories to the Lib Dems and Labour, just still, 20 months on, from that roar of noise that Brexit afforded people just haven't got it. The reasons that lay behind the Brexit vote were many, and no progress at all, as far as I can see, has been made in politics about acknowledging, confronting and addressing why it was that a town like mine, which has consistently voted Labour for nearly 100 years, that is full of people who believe in global cooperation but want to see much more local control, felt so enraged by decades of decline, as Will illustrated really well with those slides, that they felt that they needed to vote against almost the entirety of the Labour Party in voting to leave the EU. And I want to say something about what has happened as a consequence of those trends that Will talked about, that we've documented at the Centre for Towns, about the ageing of our towns and villages and the way in which our cities are growing younger and younger. Because what it's done in a town like mine is it's left us, like many towns across the country, at the sharp end of the social care crisis. The political system's inability to come together and solve that problem has a huge and disproportionate effect on the lives of my constituents, not just the older population, but all of my constituents who are afraid of what happens when their parents grow old, when they grow old, and the impact that that will have on their children too. As more and more young people have left to get opportunities to study or to work and then not come back, which is a change in Wigan over the last 30 years, what we've seen is that the jobs that used to be dangerous, difficult, dirty work down the coal mines, on the railways, that were stable, well paid and offered some opportunities for career progression have disappeared, and they've been replaced largely with jobs at which you go in at entry level on the minimum wage and you stay there for good. Quite often you don't have a permanent contract. When you look to the future, you see very little hope, not just for yourself, but for your children as well. It's what fueled a lot of the anger behind the EU. Because when there was a week during the referendum when a Labour politician was out talking about the NHS and said, look, you're much more likely to be treated by a migrant in the National Health Service than you are to be queuing behind one. It was a neat line, it was a good argument. But the problem was, as one young woman explained to me on the doorstep, that she lives within spitting distance of the hospital. We've just abolished the nursing bursary. She said to me, why should I thank my lucky stars that we can attract people from across the world to work in this hospital when I haven't got a hope of getting a job like that? My mum did it, my auntie does it, I want to do it, but you're taking away my chance to do it as well. We've started looking more and more about what that change in the nature of work in towns means for people. And what we've found is that because spending power is reduced, it's meant that bus services that are commissioned on the basis of passenger numbers have disappeared. It's meant that high streets are struggling, that community banks are disappearing. We released research recently that showed that in towns are the places that have been most hard hit by the closure of banks as opposed to villages or cities in recent years. Community pubs can't sustain themselves, and so they're going in lots of areas. The one place in towns like mine where people can go and find a friendly face and participate in community life. These are all things that people live in towns for, that shared sense of community life, that vibrancy, that the fact that you know your neighbours. Towns often poor, as Will demonstrated, in economic assets, but rich in social assets, and people value them. And it wasn't in those areas that where people have nothing left to lose, as many in the media would have you believe it, that people felt most strongly during the Brexit referendum that they had to seize this opportunity to get us to wake up and listen. It was precisely in those areas where people do still have something left to lose. The last line of defence for the things that matter. And our failure to understand that, to acknowledge it and to deal with it is what's fueling that sense of frustration. It's why, frankly, many of my constituents will not give us a hearing on questions around the customs union or a customs union, around the single market, because we've skipped the most important part of the debate and we've gone straight to the end. And what they're telling us loud and clear is that we do not have a right to be heard about the UK's future relationship with Europe until we've told them what we're going to do to address the causes of that anger in the first place. And I am absolutely clear that our future has to lie in a close relationship with the EU if we're going to even begin to address some of those issues that we talked about. The areas that will be most hard hit by pursuing a low-wage, low-standard economy are areas like mine. But we do not have the right to be heard about that yet because we haven't even begun to acknowledge why people felt so angry in the first place. I think there is a source of optimism, though, for my party and for people on the sort of progressive wing of British politics, and it's this, that all the way through the surge in support for UKIP and then the vote to leave the European Union, I never really got a sense in towns like mine that the likes of Nigel Farage really spoke for people. The questions constantly raised with me on the doorstep about UKIP. You know, one man said to me, well, I want to vote for them because I want to let you lot know that you've got to change, but I'm worried that it's a bit racist to do it. There was a reason, I think, why we saw such a dramatic decline in support for UKIP at the general election last year in towns across the country. It wasn't, in my view, as Farage would have it, that they've won on Brexit and therefore people don't feel the need to vote for UKIP anymore. I think it was much more actually that sort of Little England approach never really spoke for people in towns like mine. It never really captured the source of the frustration. But if UKIP don't speak for those Leave voters in northern towns like Wigan, who does? And at the moment, that's the question that I think needs to be posed to every political party, including my own. We need to convince people that we have a vision for the future of this country that includes areas like mine, which, as Will demonstrated in a piece of research recently, people feel much more strongly in towns than in cities that politicians don't care about them or their area. I think there is cause for optimism, though, because the trends that we've documented at Centre for Towns are completely redrawing the political map of the UK. I mean, summed up quite well, I think, at the last election in the loss of Mansfield for Labour, but the gain of Canterbury. You know, quite startling results that we saw. And as villages and rural areas are becoming much deeper blue, and cities are becoming much deeper red, towns are now the key battleground in British politics. They can be ignored no longer. Whichever political party starts to wake up and hear what lay behind that roar of noise that we heard in June 2016, I think will win the chance to shape the future of this country. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to all three fantastic panellists there. I'm now going to derail the conversation slightly by asking a question about semantics. But it strikes me that you can kind of project what you want to see onto this word city. As I understand it, the Centre for Cities and the Centre for Towns cover a lot of the same places in that kind of maybe 100,000 to 200,000 population bracket. And Lisa, you instinctively sort of fell into describing Wigan as a town, but I think outside the northwest, a lot of people would sort of see it primarily as a part of Greater Manchester rather than a place in its own right.
Whoa! Right.
But
I thought it was stuck between Manchester and Liverpool.
Well, Lancashire, thank you.
But the reason I think this is important is because, like, depending on where you put the boundary between these different types of places, you can get a completely different message as to what's happened in politics. So, like, how are we defining cities as these, you know, the liberal, progressive, pro-Remainy places? Like, how big are we talking here? Where's the kind of line here? Will, I'm going to throw that in.
Where's the line? I mean, as with all these things, you can draw the line in different places. One of the things we've been interested in terms of Centre for Towns is looking at different typologies of what would constitute a city. And I think for us, we differentiate between, you know, kind of core cities, very large urban centres, and smaller cities, large towns, right down through to areas that might be called communities and rural areas. So I think we have an interest, I think, both beyond cities, and I think it's actually quite important, I think, that, not to speak to what other people are doing, that I focus on cities as the model of economic growth is one of the core reasons behind the politics we're seeing and the policy challenges we're seeing. So I think Centre for Towns is really interested in actually understanding what lies beneath the core cities of the UK in the hinterlands beyond. And I think some work we will be doing more of, I'm looking at Ian Warren in the audience, is to start to actually classify the different sorts of ways in which we might understand towns. So, for example, it's, we can talk about towns in terms of size, but actually a little bit of work that Gerry and I have done is looking at differences between post-industrial towns, coastal towns, university towns, market towns. I think to get a really rich, deep sense of what's going on, we really need to start to dig beneath that because, as Dave Runciman put to me in a seminar in Cambridge a couple of weeks ago, understanding the difference between Cambridge and Peterborough is actually quite complicated if you think of similar-sized places, but you can see the big difference, which is kind of the presence of a university. And I think we can start to really dig beneath that to understand what it is about particular towns that have similar demographic profiles, at least did have similar demographic profiles, and what's happened to them. Because I think actually once we start to look at places across the northeast, northwest, other parts of the country, we'll start to have a better sense by understanding that they're not only different sizes of place, but actually different sorts of place that have different sorts of experience, economic experience, cultural experience, and why that matters. So it's a very academic way of saying there are many different types of towns, but I'm not too keen on having a very simplified drawing of the line at size, and I think we need a much deeper typology of understanding what's happening in places.
John, do you want to?
No, I'm going to pass. That was an eloquent answer, so I'm going to pass.
Okay, Lisa, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, which is... Yeah, I'm sure. So I'm hoping to move the conversation on. But a lot of the conversation around the sort of, the Northern Powerhouse agenda, may it rest in peace, was basically about improved transport links. It was like, well, we don't really know how to create more jobs in Huddersfield, but if we do better train links to Manchester and Leeds, then everything will be fine. I mean, is that sufficient? I mean, where does that kind of fit in the agenda?
Okay, so it sort of, I try really hard not to have a go at you, but even just the way that you frame the question, I think, highlights the problem. So you talked about transport. It's a huge issue where I live. It's a huge issue in lots of towns in the country. But you've mentioned the word trains. Actually, if you come to almost any town in the country, buses are the issue, but they are almost never, ever on the parliamentary agenda. They're very rarely mentioned at transport questions. Virtually no attention is paid to the fact that that is the prime source of public transport for most people in towns across the country.
Outside of London.
Outside of London, right. So there is a real issue here, is that if you allowed us to make decisions about how transport is structured and how that money is spent, we would be having a completely different debate than the debate that is being had at the moment. We would never have started with High Speed 2. We would have started by connecting up cities and towns across the north of England to one another. We would be investing in buses. We'd be talking much more about buses than trains. And for me, really, this is a question about power. It's not really about policy. It's about power, where power lies and who has it. That's the reason that Take Back Control absolutely caught the public mood in towns like mine, because people feel increasingly that decisions are made over which they have absolutely no control and no say, and nobody is listening or speaking for them. And that's what's got to change. And can I just say one thing about the difference between towns and cities, because Ian and Will have done a really good sort of breakdown of population size and lots of academic explanation for how we've done it. But actually, there is something else for me about this, is that I spend a lot of time in towns and cities. I was born in Manchester. I've chosen to make my home in Wigan, where my family live, and I've spent a lot of my teenage years in Bury. So I spend a lot of time knocking on doors in lots of areas of the country, and I think there is a difference, actually, between towns and cities, a cultural difference. I mean, you touched on it a bit, John, with this issue about socially liberal versus socially conservative. Sure. But Julian Baggini wrote a really good book about this called Every Town, where he went and based himself in a town. He tried to find the most typical town in the country and went and lived there for a year. And he describes this sort of process of, he calls it hefting, which is like a process by which I think cows sort themselves into different groups. He says basically people are very like that in that we choose to live in different places alongside people who are quite like us. And when you come to a town, what you will find is that a lot of people are prepared to sacrifice the kind of fast pace and diversity of cities and connectedness of cities for the sense of community and stability, the green open spaces. I get more letters from my constituents about green open spaces than I do about any other issue. And there's the key point that I really want to get across is that for this group of people, for those of us who've chosen to live in towns for precisely those reasons, because those are the things that we care about, the erosion of them over the last 30 years has been devastating. These are the things that most matter to us, and these are precisely the things, the stability, the security, the community life that are disappearing. But nowhere in the public debate in that time have I really seen this highlighted and surfaced, and that's why we set up Centre for Towns, because more than anything, people need a voice.
I'm going to go to the audience before I get myself into any more trouble. There's a lady here at the front, and then a gentleman behind her. We'll take two at a time.
Thank you very much. Carol Walker, fascinating contributions, all of them. I wonder how you feel this will play out in the forthcoming local elections, whether we're going to see this divide further intensified. And I'd be interested in what Lisa feels will be the result of Labour's move towards a soft Brexit, towards embracing the single market, and how that's going to play in a community like hers, which voted very strongly to leave. Thank you.
And the chap just behind as well.
Daniel Winkle from Cardiff University. It strikes me that the debate at Westminster around Brexit has moved away to some extent from issues around immigration and is increasingly interpreting take back control in terms of sovereignty. It's also the case, I think, that people on the other side of the debate use the idea of sovereignty as an argument for taking control back to Parliament over the negotiation process. It strikes me that idea of sovereignty and its connection to take back control is hard to reconcile with the ideas that Lisa's been talking about in Wigan that her constituents think of when they talk about taking back control. And I just wonder if the panel have reflections on the relationship between those different ideas of control. Okay, so local elections, Labour moving to a soft Brexit, and the meaning of take back control. Jonn, do you want to start with?
The short answer to your question, Carol, is yes, but it does therefore mean that the local elections will have to be interpreted very, very carefully. For those of you who are not aware, we have local elections in England for all of the seats on the London boroughs, together with 1/3 of the seats in most parts, occasions a bit different, for seats in many of the more urban parts of England, but not for the most part in the rural parts. And we know that London voted to remain. Well, sorry, one other point about the seats that are up for the grabs are, for the most part, seats that were last fought over in 2014 at the same time as the European Parliament elections. We know from what happened in the 2017 election is that basically speaking, Remain areas moved towards Labour to some degree, and certainly Remain areas moved away from the Conservatives. That if London simply largely replicates what it did 12 months ago, London is going to move towards the Labour Party, relatively speaking. And given that London is going to account for about 40% of the seats, and virtually all of the councils where actually there's a real prospect of control changing hands because it's a whole council election, unlike elsewhere, London is likely to dominate. But in so doing, London could also mislead. If you look at the places that have elections outside of London, the average vote for Leave was 45%, which is exactly the same as was true of provincial England in June 2016. And therefore, it is quite possible that given that the opinion polls at the moment are suggesting that the Labour Party has a small lead over the Conservatives, which is what they had 4 years ago in the 2014 election, that therefore, while Labour gains ground in London, it may well lose ground in places outside of London, no, not necessarily in Wigan, because some of these places are quite, and we know the Conservatives did really well in those places, such as Mansfield. So yes, I think, because unlike Will, I think Brexit matters, that I think it will matter in the local elections, but in so doing, it will potentially send a message that is unduly favourable to the Labour Party and too unkind to the Conservatives. But you know, it depends on it is. Very quickly on Daniel's question, because I'll then let everybody have a chance to say. Yes, sure, but should we be surprised, all right? First rule of politics, politicians want the institution of which they are a member to have most power. Thus, Lord Heseltine complains about councillors wanting to hang on to their power, all right? But equally, sure, one of the reasons why some MPs are keen on Brexit is because they think it will make the institution of which they are a member more powerful. That's the arguments about sovereignty, and yes, rather less about immigration. That said, do bear in mind that the fundamental failure of the European project in this country was to instill a sense that we are European, Europe is other, thus the legitimacy of Brussels having any role in UK law and governments is always problematic, and without that we wouldn't be, immigration would not have been as powerful as it was. So you're right, we've moved away from immigration, but don't forget that the fundamental question, which is the legitimacy of the role of the European Union in this country, is one about which lots of people have quite a lot of doubt, and that, of course, is what the sovereignty argument for the general public is expressing.
Will.
I don't really have much to add to what John would say much more authoritatively. No, I was going to actually push back and say to John, I haven't said that Brexit doesn't matter. I think one of the things I was pushing back against slightly was about the rush to frame Brexit as a realigning event, when I would agree with it's disruptive, but I think some of the long-term trends are there already. But
well, we won't know whether it's realigning until another 20 years or so, will we?
No.
But I would suggest to you that it has, the social liberal, social conservative dimension now matters more at the level of the individual voter than it did even in 2015. That's where you and I disagree.
I think I agree with that.
Oh, okay, fine.
Lisa.
So for most of my constituents, I think that the decision to leave the EU was quite finely balanced. In all the time that I spent most of that 6 months campaigning in northern towns like mine, and in all of that time, the conversations that I had with most people were genuine conversations. People would want to ask questions about, some of the claims that were being made on both sides. They'd want to probe, interrogate it. It's why I think that the response from most of the political world to say that people were too stupid to understand the question, or that they were basically just racist, was completely tone deaf to what had just happened. And in the end, one woman described it to me on referendum day as a choice between heart and head, and heart won out, which is why I agree with exactly what you just said about people seeing the European project as other. Although I think, to be honest, they see Parliament in exactly the same way as well. So, not sure where it takes you, but so before Cameron decided to call the referendum, Europe was never really an issue that was raised with me at all.
But immigration surely was.
Immigration was often on the doorstep, but when you probed it, what often lay behind it was concerns about housing, about jobs, about wages, about opportunities for young people. And so there's something much more nuanced, I think, that's happened that we've never made a serious attempt to understand. And I think that people would be willing, actually, to give us a hearing on why it's important to maintain the high standards that Europe demands, why it's important to continue trading with the EU. Heinz is based in my constituency. It's a major source of jobs. People did understand those arguments and did care about them and take them into account as part of the decision. So I think the shift that Labour's made, broadly speaking, is the right one, and one in which we would get a hearing for in towns like mine. But the problem is this, that unless we're able to convince people that we have a compelling vision for the future of the country that includes areas like mine, we won't win the right to get that hearing and to be able to convince people about the future relationship with the EU. We can't afford to put the cart before the horse, I suppose, is what I'm arguing. In terms of the local elections, I feel it's a very different debate, actually. In all of the campaigning that we're doing at the moment, the questions that are being surfaced with us are much more about the impact of cuts and austerity. In 2017, it felt like there'd been a complete shift in the intervening 2 years since the last general election. In 2015, people were saying to me, but it's not that bad, is it? In 2017, people were saying, I'm really, really worried about what's happening, particularly with the National Health Service. So I think that the impact that the cuts are now starting to have on everybody, not just the very poorest, is going to be the most determining factor in the local elections.
Another couple of questions. There's a chap there, and... Okay, chap at the back then.
Will Brett from the New Economics Foundation. I also just want to sort of jump in and defend Will Jennings on the Brexit point slightly, because my understanding is that the analysis is that Brexit is the first time where the real divide in the country has found expression electorally, a divide which isn't able to find expression in the sort of day-to-day electoral politics of the two parties, because those two parties cross that divide. So it's very important, but it's sort of pre-existing. But I also sort of think that the Will's analysis is fascinating because it kind of it makes place the important thing. So rather than looking at specific demographics or interests, it's place that matters. And my question is, if that's right, if it's where you live that matters, what does that mean for policy? There's a lot of talk about place-based policy or place-first policy, but what does it mean in practice? We've had a little bit of a discussion about transport. What else can we do to develop a policy agenda that starts to do something about some of the places that are struggling?
And the gentleman over there is the other one.
Paul Johnson, I was citywide, and I'm from Wigan, not the big transport project with that, from George Osborne's plan, was all about HS3, speeding the connection, shaving off 10 minutes between Manchester and Leeds. I think this led to a frustration of people in towns. It's not what they want. If you go, as Lisa talked about bus services, in the northeast, former pit village in Ashington, there's a train line that runs past there, no passenger services into Newcastle. If you speak to manufacturers located in towns, they're not really that bothered about trains. It's a strategic road network. I think it's more smaller scale transport investments that the north, and especially people in towns, want around these big projects, focusing on maybe one or two cities. And I think there's a lot of frustration that I think actually led to the Brexit debate, that people in these towns aren't being listened to.
Is there a question there, or is this...
Yeah, just, well, it's the point really about the focus of transport investment. Where do you think that should be?
Okay, so the role of place in policy making, and how do you make local transport happen, I suppose? Who'd like to go first on that?
I'll quickly agree with being agreed with. I mean, I'll try and actually put it more eloquently. I think what Gerry and I would argue is that Brexit is both the culmination of a series of economic, social changes and a critical moment in the shaping of the new political world we live in. So I think that's why our argument about it not precisely being a simple realignment, because I think the process has been ongoing for a long time. And I think further support to our argument is that, actually was mentioned, the sense in which similar processes are happening across advanced democracies and advanced industrial economies across the world. And I think there is something similar going on that is not just about a simple story about migration. And in terms of place-based policy, place and policy making, I think part of what our research agenda is about is actually understanding that the impact of city-based growth strategies is all very well for cities and places like London that weren't, as Jonn was saying, weren't traditionally framed as kind of necessarily the hub of growth. But we then need to have a sense of what do we do with places that have been experiencing economic decline and the sorts of kind of sense of kind of cultural loss. And I don't think there are simple answers, but I think the importance of place is actually starting to have a conversation about why, you know, HS2 may be good for the cities that it connects, but may mean nothing for towns, villages, and the local communities and economies that are not based on that economic model, and what we do with those. And if Gerry Stoker was here, he always talks about if you go to America or Australia, that they actually have towns that are deserted, right, that have been left. We don't do that in much of Europe, but that does leave a certain sorts of politics and does leave certain sorts of policy problems. And that's why I would fully agree that, you know, a shift towards understanding place-based policy making, both in technical terms, but also in terms of identity, is really important.
Jonn?
Let me half agree with you about the social liberal, social conservative divide, and maybe it'd be quite useful just to take the argument a little bit further. You're absolutely right. There's long been a difference between social liberals and social conservatives, okay? But what changed in 2017 was the way in which it was expressed. Hitherto, insofar as social liberals versus social conservatism mattered to electoral choice, it mattered to whether or not, on the one hand, you voted Liberal Democrat, or on the other hand, you voted UKIP. And clearly, there's a sense in which Will is right, that certainly the rise of UKIP is certainly an indication that predates, but also, of course, in a sense, presages Brexit, whereby that dimension is becoming more important. What, however, is fascinating about the 2017 election is that it's always been true that the Conservative Party has been somewhat better strong amongst social conservatives, and the Labour Party is stronger amongst social liberals. But the fascinating thing is how in 2017 that division strengthened in shaping the people's choice for our two largest parties, as opposed to shaping choice for two peripheral parties. And that's what I would argue that has changed, and why, therefore, it's disruptive, because it means that Lisa here is agonizing about, does she follow the left-wing instinct of her voters in Wigan, or does she follow what is perhaps the social conservative instinct as some of her voters in Wigan? But equally, many a Conservative MP is having to sort out, do they go with the economically liberal instinct of their traditional middle-class business constituency, or do they go with the protectionist instinct of the new electorate that the Conservative Party has recently acquired? And that creates a major internal tension within both our parties. But that's why I would argue that Brexit has disrupted things, and why, as it were, yes, it's part of the story, of course, it's laying and what was going on beyond, but why the way in which it's being played out now, that it's different. Otherwise, so far as the role of place is concerned, I mean, from what I do, which is try to understand behaviour, there are two distinctions we need to make. One is, our place is different because they have different kinds of people, and our place is different because actually, even if you are, for example, an older person without any educational qualifications, but because you live in this cosmopolitan city, are you therefore more likely to be socially liberal? And I'm not sure we've done enough work on that distinction. It's certainly standard fare to suggest that both things matter. And certainly, you know, you've only got to look at the demography of London. This is the youngest part of the country. This is the most ethnically diverse part of the country. This is the most educationally qualified part of the country. And undoubtedly, part of therefore the geography of Brexit is simply to do with the geography of individuals, rather than necessarily something that's going on within this city on top of the character of individuals within it.
Lisa.
So, I mean, I don't really agree with some of that, because I think that the question for politicians is less about agonising about the right choice for the country and more about how to build and win the argument in the country. And that, I think, is what the Tories are grappling with a very different vision from ours, and what we're grappling with as well. It seems to me, actually, that Labour's dilemma is the country's dilemma. We represent some of the most heavily Leave and heavily Remain areas of this country.
Yeah, but Lisa,
we have to speak for both.
Your electorate is predominantly a Remain electorate, and as I did, the electorate of the Labour Party is predominantly Remain, and as I also showed before the 2017 election, even in most Labour held constituencies in the north of England, the Midlands, a majority of Labour voters voted to remain.
No, I accept that. I agree with that.
It's all the Tories and UKIP voters in your constituency that were voting to leave.
But that's sort of based on the idea that we're only interested in the prospects of the Labour Party. But if what you're grappling with is how to solve this problem for the country, I represent 75,000 people in Wigan, half of whom didn't vote for me, but I am their Member of Parliament and I have to make this work for them. Sure. And if what you're interested in is the interests of the country, then you've got to find a way through that takes both sides of this with you. And the reason that I think Will's research is so important is because it shows that there are very fundamental differences that have been surfaced by Brexit. We had some warning signs, I think, before, Will, to sort of come to your question with the, we had record low turnout, then we had a surge in support for UKIP in towns like mine. I think all of these things should have told us that there was a problem that needed to be responded to. But I think after Brexit, we have finally at least understood that people are trying to send us a very clear message. The question is, can we find a way through this that works for the whole country? And that's what politicians ought to be turning their attention to, not just how will I fare best with, in terms of my electoral prospects when all this is over. And actually, it sort of links to the two questions that were asked, really, because in the end, this is all about power. Who has it? Who has the power to actually shape their own lives and determine their own destinies? And that example that you gave, Paul, is absolutely stunning because Bridget Phillipson, one of the Sunderland MPs, was saying to me the other day, she doesn't even have a train station in her constituency. People are literally standing by the tracks watching trains pass on the way to somewhere else, but with no ability to actually get on them, which is the reason she talks about buses so much. And I think in the end, we've got to have a rethink about who holds power in this country. Recently I was involved in a debate about media, whether we should move Channel 4 outside of London. A lot of the people on the panel in the broadcasting world were saying, oh yeah, we should definitely make more programmes outside of London. Well, you don't move the programme making, you move the commissioning, because then you get completely different things on the screen. If we determined how arts funding is spent in local areas, you wouldn't have the absolutely outrageous situation where £8 is currently spent by the Arts Council in Islington for every £1 that's spent in all of the coalfield communities in this country. And that's what fuels people's sense of anger, because they can see very clearly what's happening here. Somebody is benefiting, but frankly, it's not us. And just finally on place-based policy making, because I think, Will, it's a really important issue, is that it's not just about trying to move power, is it, from Whitehall to the town hall. It's actually about trying to get people involved in shaping their own communities. In towns like mine, that's where we've seen real progress being made over recent years. Wigan Council has launched something called The Deal, which was originally to try and help us get through all of the cuts that were being made. But what it's done is bring people much more into decision-making about how the money that we do have is spent. And I think that's the lesson from the last Labour government, actually, is that it's very easy for a new government to come in and close down Sure Start centres. It's very, very hard to close down a community energy scheme that has been built and is run by hundreds of people in a local area. That's how you get lasting change, and that's how you get a sense, frankly, that we're all in this together.
We are very sadly out of time. I think we could probably keep talking about this stuff for a lot longer, but if you could join me in thanking our panellists.